Good evening and welcome to the March 2019 edition of League of Women Voters Presents, the monthly public affairs show about issues important to Mid-Missouri and elsewhere. I'm Mike McKean. I'm the Associate Director of the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and I'm sitting in for your regular host, Randy Picht. Tonight we're talking about the First Amendment, free expression, and the free press with an expert on that subject, Sandy Davidson, who is a curator's professor and a colleague of mine here at the Missouri School of Journalism. We're focusing on free press and citizen access issues because we're taping this during what we're calling Sunshine Week, and people are curious about why sunshine. Well, one reason is that journalists and First Amendment scholars often point to a quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. He said, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants." Sandy, what did he mean by that back then, and how does that apply to some of the struggles over access and free expression we have today?
What we're talking about basically is transparency. And when I was studying philosophy, I decided that the most important thing, if you wanted to separate free societies from the more closed societies, was access to government information. You need to know what your government is doing, and especially when you're going to be going to vote on issues.
Are we having problems and focus particularly at the moment on sort of local and state issues? Are we having problems with the ability to access information? Are there laws that you would like to see strengthened, proposed laws that you're concerned about that the Missouri legislature is discussing? What's sort of the landscape right now in our state with regard to First Amendment and free expression?
Well, I think we have pretty good sunshine laws. There's some room for improvement, but just want to start with part of our sunshine law that says, and I'm quoting, "It is the public policy of this state that meetings, records, votes, actions, and deliberations of public governmental bodies be open to the public unless otherwise provided by law." And it continues, saying it shall be, the sunshine law, liberally construed and exceptions strictly construed to promote this public policy. So, the presumption is that records and meetings are open. If somebody wants to close them, they have to point to a law that permits it.
Which all sounds, assuming that we're enforcing that law, pretty good. So what are the challenges, both in terms of the execution of that law and some challenges to that law from our own lawmakers?
Okay, well, we had a constitutional amendment approved by 62 to 38% that talked about legislative records, I'm going to quote again, shall be public records and subject to generally applicable state laws governing public access to public records, including the Sunshine Law. But we have legislators, I will not mention names, but who have this House Bill number 445. And it's dreadful.
What does it propose to do?
It says this: any document or record, including electronic communications, received or prepared by or on behalf of a member of a public governmental body, consisting of advice, opinions, and recommendations in connection with the deliberative decision-making process of said body, will be closed.
That sounds like that's pretty much a frontal assault to sunshine law.
It's an absolute contradiction. Yeah. We're the show me state. This is the don't show me. Let me have people giving me advice, documents, or whatever, and I will not let you know what they are advising me.
So obviously, we would say, those of us who are free press advocates, that that's a bad idea, but what could legislators possibly use as a rationale behind doing that, and how would you deconstruct those arguments?
Well, one rationale that I've heard is we've got to protect the privacy of those folks who are giving us advice or who are doing the documentation for us. My goodness. This would also protect people who are, in effect, lobbying. How do you know if the advice is good advice or not good advice? We need, I do believe, the watchdog function. We need to know what kind of things are being thought of by the legislators. There may be gaps. They may be given wrong information. But if we don't have access to it, we can't correct it. And there goes the process. I really like what Mark Twain said. Those that respect the law and love sausage should watch neither being made. Well, I think we should watch them being made. We need to have access to government information if we're going to have a functioning democratic society.
It seems like without this proposed law, there are already ways that lawmakers and government officials can now use technology to try to get around the Sunshine Law. We remember what our governor tried to do with mobile apps to encrypt conversations. So
Right.
it's difficult enough without having a law that challenges our right to see that information.
Right, and now with the electronic modes of communication, we've had to have some changes in law to make very clear that it's not just the paper records, it's also, of course, the electronic records that we need access to. And also, we need to know what is going on if there's kind of this chain going on. So they're not getting together, but they are speaking kind of one on one in a loop. There are ways to get around access if you want to be, may I use the word, sneaky.
Yeah.
But good legislators are going to want to listen to their constituents. I do believe that.
So all of this, I think, makes sense to most people at a policy level. But you've been, in the trenches representing School of Journalism media outlets. Give me an example or two that the public could understand as to what happens when these laws are not enforced, or when we have challenges to this whole notion of access to information and free expression.
Well, for one thing, it certainly slows down the process. If you want access to public records, the law says that the record should be produced as soon as possible and a 3-day at the outside, unless there are really some sort of extraneous circumstances that prevent that. But if you have a custodian of records who says, no, in effect, they're my records, you can't get hold of them, and you have to take them to court, that is a battle. It takes time. And the way we have the law written now, if you win by a preponderance of the evidence, you can get your attorney's fees paid if there was a knowing or a purposeful violation. But it's so difficult to show a knowing or purposeful violation. For example, if you have attorneys who are giving the custodian of records wrong advice, you'll have the judge say, yes, you should have gotten the records, but no, it wasn't knowing and purposeful. The custodian of records was listening to the attorney.
So far we've been talking about state and local issues. I want to pull back for a minute and focus on federal. We all know that the First Amendment is the bedrock of free expression, but we also have federal Freedom of Information Act laws, and we have a lot of court precedents over the years that have shaped how we think about and how we practice. I think of one particular case I know I've heard you talk about quite a bit with our students, New York Times v. Sullivan,
Yes.
and it's about libel, so to a certain extent it's not really about freedom of information, but it certainly has important ramifications for the media. And here we have Justice Clarence Thomas, who actually was speculating in a decision about a month ago about changing that law.
Right. Let's talk about the way we used to have libel law and the revolution. Justice William Brennan wrote a decision in 1964 that totally turned around the way we were doing libel law. It used to be every way a journalist would not want it. Strict liability. That means that the only question was this: are those your words? Kind of like nowadays we have strict liability if you own a wild animal. Let's say you own a tiger and it gets loose and kills somebody or somebody's pet. The only question is that your tiger? That's strict liability. Also, damages were just assumed, and the burden of proof was always on the journalist. The journalist
Right.
had to prove truth. 1964, the Supreme Court said, wait a minute. This is having a chilling effect on the media, because the media may know full well that a story is right, but be so afraid to have to prove it in court. So everything changed. Now, a journalist who is working on a matter of public concern that involves a public official or a public figure can only be found liable for libel if it's an intentional falsehood.
Right, when people hear actual malice, I'm not sure they
Mhm.
know exactly what that means, but you know what it means, so explain it.
Okay, actual malice. It's got two legs. One is knowing that the statement was false. You know that it's false, you publish it anyway. That's intentional. The other leg is called reckless disregard. That means you really do entertain serious doubts. Is the story correct? Is it not? What the heck, I'm running with it anyway.
Right.
So, not only does the plaintiff have to prove actual malice, but by what's called clear and convincing evidence, just, preponderance of the evidence, a little over 50%, that's not good enough. The Supreme Court itself said we need to give journalists breathing space. Yeah. The Supreme Court recognized that journalists are human, human beings make errors, but unless it is intentional, you'll be cut a break.
But now Donald Trump, both as a candidate and as president, has said he'd like to change the libel laws to make it easier for public figures to sue the press. I don't know how many people took that too seriously, yes. But now when we have a Supreme Court justice suggesting he might want to change it, we don't know if any of the other justices agree with that notion, but how likely do you think it is that the Supreme Court could actually reverse or weaken New York Times v. Sullivan?
New York Times versus Sullivan was a unanimous decision. Yeah. Not only that, there were 3 justices that would have gone even further. They would have given absolute, unconditional protection. If you're talking about a public official and how the public official is doing his or her job, that public official could not sue for libel, period. Yeah. So there would be a lot of law to buck.
Well, so I brought up the president, and clearly he has been attacking individual journalists. He talks about fake news. He accuses news organizations of being the enemies of the American people. I know there's some history to think about here, and you can shed some light on that, but how worried are you that the president's attacks are weakening the public's support for the First Amendment and a free press?
Honestly, I'm not terribly concerned.
Yeah.
Historically, you can go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson talking about the lies in the press and how people who didn't read anything in the press would actually be better informed. So it's not that Trump is trumpeting a new concept. Also, when you think about it, do you really want the press and the president to be in sync, kind of a love fest? That worries me. I don't want the press to be a lapdog.
Agree, but I also don't want the president to convince some unstable supporters to send bomb threats or threaten violence against the media either.
No, absolutely not. You don't want instigation to violence. But over the long haul, we have had attacks on the press before Nixon. It's something that we've weathered in the past. We'll weather it now. We have strong enough foundations with people wanting a free press, wanting access to information, that I don't think a president with Twitter Fest will make an ultimately, long-lasting.
Well, here's something we haven't had to deal with until maybe the last 10, 12 years, and that's the social media. Both the companies who are out there invading our privacy, accessing our data, helping to share false information, and then you have individuals on social media who have, I think, coarsened our civil discourse to the point where there's concern about whether or not we can actually have conversations that a free press is supposed to foster.
I call it unsocial media. One thing that disturbs me, you have your broadcasters, you have your press, and they allow public comment. And sometimes the public comments are so distasteful. However, Congress made a decision back in 1996 to say this: if you are an internet service provider, or if you're, say, a news organization and you allow these postings by third parties, you are not going to be liable for the libel that it contains. It was a policy decision. Again, we want free discussion, but Congress also made clear that you could have a scrubbing if you want. You could have the news media or the internet service provider going through trying to screen out the worst of the worst, trying to have a more social commentary, if you want, trying to delete some of the vile material. And you probably follow trolls every once in a while on the media. It does get vile.
It does, and you see different approaches to try to rein that in. In Europe, for example, there are laws to give people the right to be free from having their data collected.
Yes.
There are attempts to regulate the big social media companies in ways that are meant to protect our privacy and our data.
Yes.
In the U.S., we have taken a different approach, although it seems that the Cambridge Analytica case and what happened in our presidential election may be causing lawmakers and regulators to take a different view of these companies.
Well, when you start in talking about the collection of data, the European Union was far ahead of us in trying to protect privacy. The ultimate privacy principle is that the information that you voluntarily give up to the government will not be shared with third parties or used for another purpose without your consent. The way we were doing the wholesale, data sharing made the European Union at one point really question, how do we do business with the United States? So we are moving more to the European model. One area where the European model is different than ours is on the right to be forgotten.
Right.
Some of us have things in our past that we would prefer not to have dredged up. So we had a case involving Google, and it was a Spanish jurisdiction, but the EU said you do have a right to be forgotten. If you have a criminal record, you shouldn't have that, dragging you down as a ball and chain for the rest of your life. But over here, the attitude is you can't rewrite history. If it happened, it happened, and we do not follow the right to be forgotten, at least yet. Maybe
No,
we'll
and
get
I
there.
think there are arguments one could make that at
Sure.
least with public figures or people who are thrust into the public limelight, corporate executives, politicians, and
Yes.
others, we really do need to have the ability, since the internet is our primary archive for researching these days, that we can't just say you can have any data about yourself that you don't like scrubbed from the record.
Oh, right. But now you're getting into people who are doing something that is a matter of public concern. We also have matters of purely private concern that perhaps we might want to have scrubbed.
So I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about external factors basically to the affecting the press and free expression for a while, but let's talk about the industry of the media and of journalism in the United States. I mean, we have a situation now where newspapers especially are laying off large numbers of
Yes.
staff, closing in some
Yes.
places. We have examples here in Missouri and in other states of what we're now calling news deserts, where communities really don't have access to information from a press outlet. I'm wondering what you think those economic effects are going to have on people who depend on the media and depend on access to information.
It does concern me that the local media is in danger. And as you said, there are some media deserts. What's happening? You're having these media companies that are swooping in and gobbling up these newspapers, these local newspapers, and then basically sucking them dry, trying to get every financial benefit out of them that they can, and in the process really destroying the local newspaper. What can you say? This has been happening with big news organizations laying off people, even Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. So we do have a shrinking market for journalists. And what we have filling the void, the social or unsocial media, if you look at news and what's going out over the internet, and you start in filtering back to see, okay, where did that come from? What we're finding is that there's more and more aggregating. It will come back to fewer and fewer news sources. So you have a news organization that is paying big bucks sometimes, and then that information is being siphoned off, aggregated, and I don't know how this business model will hold up. One thing that has concerned me in the beginning, when things were on the internet, the news was free, it was on the internet, and that is now pretty much the expectation. So, how do you close the door after the horses, or the barn door after the horses are out? How do you change the model? How do you convince people that indeed they need to pay for news that's on the internet?
And it's kind
hard.
of a chicken and egg problem. I mean, we in the media have fostered that by agreeing with this notion that information needs to be free until we had to find something to replace all the advertising dollars, which have been siphoned
Yes,
off into Facebook and Google and
right.
Craigslist and a lot of other places. But now we've got a public that's conditioned to thinking that our news should be just as free as all the other information that's out there on
Yes,
social
yes,
media.
yes. Not taking into consideration how much it costs, for example, to have a foreign correspondent, but how important it can be.
I think what we're finding, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but we're finding that one of the models that may work in communities is not unlike what we do with public media. That's finding people to be members, to be invested, to
Yes,
be part of a team in a community. Because I don't think that if the local radio station, the local newspaper goes out of business or is essentially left with just one or two reporters to cover a
yes.
community, that there's any substitute for what they do.
Right. And the model of NPR, KBIA, KOPN,
Yeah.
if you value the local news, making a contribution, knowing that it does help you and the community back to access to information.
Yeah.
That's a very important access point, your local news media.
So, do you see any examples here in Missouri or elsewhere where we're making strides with new or innovative approaches to getting access to information and sharing that information with the public?
I think right now we are in flux.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out what will be the model. So now we have paywalls going up. So to access a newspaper, you'll get, say, maybe 10 free hits. So you get a little bit of the free stuff, but after that, you do pay. Or to access the information, you have to answer a few little questions. And the advertisers then are paying the news media to get the answers to those questions. Maybe that's a model that can help. We'll just have to see how this falls out.
I'm thinking too of some projects that we've had some association with at the School of Journalism, one called Access Missouri, where journalists worked with state archivists in the House and Senate to try to come up with ways to get data from our legislative records, our hearings, our bills online, and then finding a way to make that so that the public can easily access that information. I don't think we've come up with the perfect way of doing that or the way to support it, but I wonder if you think there is an appetite in the public, not just with journalists, to be able to access this kind of routine legislative and state government information that way.
I would hope so. The federal system mandates that records will be electronic, they will be available. I remember the not so good old days when you had to pay thousands of dollars for records and you had to wait for so long. records that now, 3 o'clock in the morning in your pajamas, you can access because they are online. In Missouri, what we do is we encourage, but we don't mandate that all the records have to be put online. I really like the online information. When Missouri first instigated online, there was a little bit of concern, I believe, by the legislators that if you could read it online, that you could manipulate it. The concept of read only had not totally filtered through. But we started first letting lawyers access the information, and it was Secretary of State information, the corporate filings and
Right.
all online. And now everybody can access the information online that is made available. Again, Missouri by law, Sunshine Law, encourages but does not mandate. I'm looking forward to Missouri maybe following the federal law and saying all of the records should be online and easily available.
So we've been focusing here for the past several minutes on challenges at the global, the national, the local, and state level to free press, freedom of
Yes.
expression, access to information. Where do you end up finding yourself now at the moment? Are you at all optimistic, or are you fairly pessimistic in the short term about where we're going in terms of giving our citizens access to the information that they need?
Well, I am concerned about the number of journalists who have been given the door. I'm concerned about the number of newspapers that are becoming absorbed into a bigger conglomerate. And, when you have a newspaper, let's say for a Missouri town being edited in Texas, that does concern me. But again, we have access to so much information now online. The good part of it, I'm thinking again back to, say, 20 years ago when you had to make your request to the federal government and you had to wait and you had to maybe shell out thousands of dollars. And now, in the middle of the night, you can just pop it up on screen and it costs you nothing. So, it really is going both directions right now.
Well, let's hope we have a little bit more movement in the positive direction than the negative. We'll
Yes.
just have to keep an eye on it. But that's all the time we have for tonight. So I would like to thank Professor Sandy Davidson, of
Thank
course,
you.
for being here. Like to thank those of you who are watching. Thank the League of Women Voters. I'm Mike McKean. Randy Pitt, your regular host, is going to be back here in this chair on the April edition, the next edition of League of Women Voters Presents. Have a good evening.